couldn't go out and play with the other children regularly. And the next best thing he could do while being at home was to pick out the books from the shelves, lots and lots of books at home there. And he began to read and read and read. And now look at the result, right? Stunning grasp of the English language. So the best way to improve your knowledge of a foreign language is to go and live among its speakers. The next best way is to read extensively in it. Second reason, reading contributes most to self-dependence in learning. Now, this is self-evident, if I might use that term. All of you have reached this point, this professional point in your lives, because you are no longer dependent on anybody, certainly not somebody called the teacher, to prove to the world that you are scholars now. How did that happen? Over a period of time, you learned to depend less and less and less on your teachers, and you began to depend more and more on your own reading ability. So you didn't really need a teacher by the time you got to your postgraduate studies. And those of you who got your PhDs now, you had nobody called a teacher sitting there and reading out to you or saying, let me help you by reading the first 2 lines for you, and so on, right? So if you want to become a self-dependent learner, and as teachers, there's this cliche, we will continue to be learners all our lives, then the aspect that will help us all is reading. The skill that will help us all is reading. Once students take charge of their own learning, they will find every reading experience liberating and empowering. Third reason, reading should be valued not only as an educational tool, but as a source of enjoyment, right? So we mustn't give children the feeling that because we are teaching them in order to do well in an exam, and because they haven't done well in that particular exam, they can now stop enjoying the act of reading. Now, that's how backwash, or washback as we call it in curriculum studies, works on children who don't perform well in exams, right? They go off reading, as I said earlier. True, we need reading, because it's only through reading that education itself can be delivered. But we mustn't forget that reading is also a source of pure pleasure, enjoyment. And I'll come back to that briefly in a moment. So good reading habits will get students hooked on books, right? So our job as a teacher is to enable our learners to pick up this reading habit. Important question now. What is reading? Have you thought about it? All of you teach reading, but have you ever thought about what constitutes the act of reading? I'm going to simplify it all by just showing you 2 views of reading. The first is what we might call the traditional view, which says the text is the sole repository of meaning. Hence, reading is decoding the message in the text. Think about that for a moment. There is something called a reading text. Who produced that reading text? Somebody called a writer. And what did the writer do? The writer told himself, I have something in my mind which I must put into writing, into text, in the form of a text. So he encodes what he has in mind, and the result becomes a text. And what does the reader do when he picks up the text? He decodes what he sees, black and white marks, in print. It therefore suggests that it's a one-way traffic. There is something called a text, that the text has meaning, and when the reading begins, the meaning begins to flow from the text into the reader. Right? So it's clearly a one-way traffic. All that the reader has to say is, I'll stay open to what is given to me. I'll receive generously what is given to me. I'll try and assimilate everything you give to me, dear writer, right? And reading will happen. Now, the way I presented it obviously suggests something is amiss with that particular view. So we now believe, a modern view, that the text has only potential for meaning. How does meaning finally emerge? It emerges when the reader breathes meaning into it. So it's the interaction between the reader and the text that produces meaning. Hence, reading is an active interrogation of the text, an active interaction between the reader and the writer. So it's a two-way process. So there is something called the text. There is somebody called the reader, right? But when they interact with one another, what the writer has encoded in the text doesn't necessarily have to go into the mind of the reader in its entirety. Because the reader can be very naughty. He can choose to ignore what the writer considers important, and he might, in fact, choose to assimilate only what the writer thinks is insignificant, right? So we know, for instance, there are readers who will remember the joke attached to a particular reading text. The reading text is about something serious, but what remains in the mind of some readers is that silly joke. Now, the whole point of the interaction is lost because the writer didn't emphasize the joke. What he emphasized was a message. We're going to look at how this happens in a moment. So please remember, it's the reader who contributes to meaning making. Here's a little quotation I thought I could read out to you. The unread story is not a story. The unread story is not a story. It is little black marks on wood pulp. The reader reading it makes it live. A live thing, a story. So the story becomes a living object only when the reader breathes meaning into it, right? That's Ursula Guin saying it for us. Okay. Very quickly, I'm not going to, this is theoretical. I'll show you nevertheless. Right? So I'm emphasizing the point that reading is an interaction between the reader and the writer. And in the process, cooperative principle, as we often call it, operates. And what is the cooperative principle which operates between the reader and the writer? The reader assumes that she, in this case the reader, and the writer are using the same code, and quite simply using the same language. So you can't pick up a book written in Telugu as somebody who doesn't know Telugu and say, I don't understand this. Obviously, you don't understand it because it's in a language that is unfamiliar to you. You have to assume, sorry, you have to assume every time you pick up a text that the writer wants to say something to you. And whatever text is in the public domain is meant to be read. What is not meant to be read is your personal diary. That's between you and yourself, right? We also assume, as part of the cooperative principle, that the writer has put this text together because he wants a number of readers to make sense of what he has put into it in the form of a message, right? Otherwise, he has no business writing and passing it on to the public. So that assumption is also made. Secondly, I'm going to use a couple of terms here for those of you who might be into reading research or about to enter reading research. We use two terms called top-down processing and bottom-up processing. Simple, actually, so don't worry too much. By top-down processing, we mean what we already have in our heads, right? All the experiences of life that we carry in our memories, in our minds, is what we call schema, right? So each one of you is blessed with an enormous memory, right? Enormous number of experiences which are wholly different from my memory, my compilation of memories, my schema, right? So every time you operate the reading process, you're using your top-down processing schema, right? Whereas bottom-up processing is what you see in the physical form on a piece of paper, printed paper, a book, a text, right? They're simply black marks, right, on a white page. But sometimes you have to make sense of those black marks before your top-down processing begins to act. So when you see a spelling mistake, for instance, you slow down and say, something's wrong with this word. You then say, the A is missing, the E is missing, the T is missing, etc. And then you reformulate your reading task. And as a result, there is an interaction between what is there in your mind already and what has been encoded by the writer in a written form, right? Now, let's look at the word I just used, schema, right? Huge area of research has been for decades, right? Some excellent research has been done in the area of schema, all of which actually affects us as teachers of reading, which is why I'm mentioning this, right? Now, as I was just saying, schema is a mental structure. You can't see it, right? And why can't you see it? Because it's abstract, right? And it's abstract because it is an accumulation of the many experiences that you and I have had already. Why do you call it a structure? A structure, by definition, is organized. So in our schemas, in our minds, we know what to do, for instance, when we are listening to a person speaking, which is what you're doing now, right? Your schema is working in such a way that you're imagining you're in a class and that the teacher is addressing you. And as a student, you're supposed to pay attention. So that's a schematic uh, uh, a reference in itself, right? Remember, with every experience, your schema is growing. In fact, the webinar itself has changed our schemas. Who would have imagined, say 6 months ago, before the coronavirus hit us, that all of India will actually be talking about online teaching, virtual teaching, right? So I'm actually addressing all of you sitting in your own homes. I couldn't have imagined it 6 months ago, as I said. So my own set of experiences are being modified now by being part of this webinar. Secondly, reading makes use of existing schemas but modifies them. I'll give you an example. I make sense of this. The bus conductor careered along and ended up in the hedge, a fence. Several passengers were hurt. The driver was questioned by the police. This is a news report from a British newspaper, right? Now, you probably think, by the way, careered means hurtling down because the brakes failed and the driver somehow had to manipulate and maneuver the car, the bus, to a safe place. So the safest place was the fence, nobody there, and rams the bus into the fence, the hedge, and it stops, right? But that's an accident, right? And people do get injured in accidents of this kind. Now, you might think that there is a bus conductor and there is a bus driver. And what is the bus conductor doing driving the bus? Am I right? Right? Now, this is a reference to a double-decker in the UK, where very often you have only one person who's the conductor and who also drives the bus. So the driver actually sits in a seat at the front, and when he comes to a bus stop, he opens the door, automatic door, and when a passenger gets in, the passenger tells him, I want to go to Charing Cross or wherever, and he'll say 50p, ma'am. You give him 50p, gives you a ticket, and then you go and find a place for yourself at the back of the bus. So he's doubling up as a conductor and a driver. Now that's something that will not immediately come to mind if you didn't know the context, right? Now, as I explained it to you, your understanding is now beginning to change. Second query. All of you must have heard me use the word he, right? When I referred to the bus conductor and the driver, I said he sits at his seat, the front of the bus, and issues tickets. And when he's done issuing the tickets, he drives. Now, very specifically, I referred to a male driver and conductor. But in the news report, it's a lady, it's a woman. She was later congratulated on her quick thinking and skillful handling of the bus when the brakes failed. Now, do you see what's happening? We have modified our schemas to allow women drivers too into our schemas, because we're used to seeing only male drivers. How many cities in India do you have female drivers? How many cities in India have female auto rickshaw drivers, right? Now, let me give you an example of what we mean by schema background knowledge. Said the Leaning Tower of Pisa to Big Ben, right? Most of you, if not all of you, will know about the Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy, a 15th century tower structure that stands at an incline. It's already leaning, and over 500 or 600 years, a degree or two increase in the angle of inclination, right? But it refuses to fall. So that's one of the wonders of modern history. Now, what is Big Ben? Many of you or all of you will know that it's the clock, the tower clock in London, in Parliament, right? The British Parliament there, and it's huge tower with a huge clock, and it's become a symbol of the city. Now, what is the Leaning Tower of Pisa saying to Big Ben, right? The tower is saying, if you have the time, Ben, I have the inclination to go out with you on a romantic date, right? Lovely, isn't it? Lovely little humorous anecdote here. But you will appreciate it only if you know a little about the Leaning Tower of Pisa, only if you know what Big Ben is. It's not enough to say, I know the word inclination, I know what it means. No, you don't really. In the context, inclination means something else. Right? Second example, the royal proclamation was completed. The king sent for his seal. Now, what does this mean? The king is sitting at his ebony desk and preparing a proclamation for his nation. And once it's all ready, he wants to authenticate it with a stamp. So, can you see my hand? He's going to stamp it, seal it, so that it becomes law, right? That's the royal proclamation, and that's the meaning of the word seal. But suppose I complicate it by saying the king was feeling lonely. He sent for a seal. Is it the same seal? Is it a quirky, eccentric king who, when he feels lonely, tells his courtier, please bring me that stamp. I want to play with it. I'm feeling lonely. If I play with it, throwing it up and down, I'll feel nice. No. What he is referring to here is the sea animal seal, right? So to be able to understand the difference between the two seals, you need to know a great deal of what we call, you need to have what we call background knowledge. Okay. Many of you in the audience must be taxpayers, right? And I hope all of you are paying your taxes. Okay. Now, sometimes you have the unfortunate experience of being summoned to the income tax office to explain ill-gotten money, let's say, or to explain how you managed to come across such a lot of money, right? So you reach the income tax office, and at the entrance of the income tax office, you see this note. watch your step. Now, why does it say that? Because there is a flight of stairs leading down to a lower level where the tax office is located. So they mean well, the officers, they're saying, be careful, right? Pay attention to the way you walk down. Otherwise, you might trip and fall and hurt yourself, right? You go into the office, you do your business, you explain everything to the commissioner inside. And when your job is done and perhaps you've paid lots and lots of fine, money as fine, reach the exit of the income tax office. And at the exit, it says, watch your language, right? So don't curse the tax officer, please, right? Now see what fun there is in appreciating this little humor, but you'll appreciate it only if you are a taxpayer and you've paid through your nose for withholding tax information, right? You curse the income tax people. There's no point doing this with your class 6, class 7, even class 10 learners. They don't have the background knowledge required to make sense of this. Okay, last two examples. Take a look at this. This is very much a topical reference, right? A topical reference because of the coronavirus and the lockdown. And this is, there's a disturbance in the background, right? Okay, thank you, right. Many of you, if not all of you, know that in the West, right, in Europe and in the Americas, if you are unemployed but registered with an employment agency, till you get a job, you get a dole, D-O-L-E. That's quite simply an unemployment allowance, right? So it might be $500 in the US, it could be $1,000, which will see you through 30 days of rent and food, right? Food and accommodation is taken care of. Now, you have to fill in a form in order to get a dole. So what does our friend do here? His occupation is a burglar. And because he's a burglar, he's unemployed. Why is he unemployed? Because everyone's at home. So he can't break in now into any home. And as a result, he's starving, right? So see how much of understanding goes into this because it's topical, right?
Aware of the words that carry the same sound as that. So you wouldn't pronounce doe as dove.
Think about it.
Pronounce as doe as an animal.
Okay. Look at this last picture now. This is from Spain, actually, right? Now, those of you who know football will appreciate it, actually. Now, this is what you call a free kick, right? Because the team in blue, some member of the team in blue, can you see the blue jerseys, has committed a foul. So the referee, who you can see at the left bottom there, signals a free kick. So a member of the red jersey team takes the kick and scores a goal. You can see the goal at the top of the net, inside the net, right? And the goalkeeper is furious. He says, what the hell have you been doing in Spanish? Why didn't you form a wall? Which is what happens.